Imagine the Earth suddenly becoming a stationary plane trapped beneath a colossal dome, where the sun is nothing more than a small ball of fire hovering directly above your head. When the flat Earth appears as a disk floating in space, an idea that runs counter to every law of physics, it is often associated with online communities where genuine belief and toxic mockery blur together. But if you pause for a moment and look more closely, you will realize that this is not merely a rejection of science. It is a deliberately constructed world, a distorted, closed geometric structure designed to shield itself from all criticism. Beneath that strange surface lies a very familiar mechanism. When people are forced to accept something that is obviously false, the entire system of standards begins to collapse. Physics is replaced by belief, evidence is pushed aside. Flat Earth, therefore, is not just a mistaken idea, but a model of control, one that shrinks reality so people can feel safe, special, and easier to guide. And this story is not only about science, but about how humans imprison themselves inside invisible cages, which we are about to decode right now. In this model, our planet is not a globe maintained by gravity or hydrostatic equilibrium. It is a stationary plane. The North Pole sits at the absolute centre, the hub of a great cosmic wheel, with the continents sprawling outward from this central axis. The known world does not end in a southern pole. Instead, it is ringed by Antarctica, which is transformed from a continent into a colossal ice wall, a frozen barrier encircling the entire perimeter of the Earth to hold the oceans in. The sky above is equally claustrophobic. The sun and moon are no longer celestial giants millions of kilometers away. In this glitch, they are reduced to small local luminaries, tiny balls of fire merely 32 miles in diameter, hovering just 6,000 kilometers above our heads. They rotate opposite each other like spotlights on a low ceiling, illuminating a localized stage rather than a planet. To the uninitiated, this defies all logic. But the architects of this theory have an answer for everything. The silence of the poles during the polar night just an anomaly, images of galaxies and spherical planets, distortions caused by zooming in on the dome covering the Earth, photos from orbit fabrications by the elite, with the UN logo itself serving as a hidden confession of the true flat map. It is a closed loop of logic where gravity is fake, space is a lie, and the horizon is the ultimate illusion. It is deceptively easy to dismiss this entire cosmology as a digital hallucination. In recent years, mocking flat earthers has become a form of consensual entertainment. We watch debunking videos where astrophysicists dismantle these theories in seconds, racking up millions of views while the believers are humiliated. The internet, in its infinite capacity for chaos, has blurred the lines so thoroughly that we're often forced to invoke Poe's law. At a certain level of extremism, it becomes impossible to distinguish a sincere fundamentalist from a dedicated troll. Was Michael Hughes the man who died in his homemade rocket a martyr for the cause, or a con artist playing a long game to secure funding? Was the documentary by Logan Paul a serious inquiry or a masterclass in satire? But if you treat this merely as a meme, you're missing the dark architecture beneath the surface. This is not a spontaneous glitch of the information age. Contrary to popular belief, this is not a lingering superstition from the Dark Ages, a period falsely accused by later historians of believing the world was flat. No, this specific brand of denialism is a modern invention born from a much more sinister origin point. The thread does not lead back to medieval peasants, but to the industrial smoke of the early 20th century. It leads to a specific coordinate, a small totalitarian town in Illinois named Zion. Here, long before Reddit threads and YouTube algorithms, a man named Wilbur Glenn Voliva weaponized this impossible geometry to build a kingdom. He understood something that modern trolls are only just rediscovering. If you can control the shape of the world in someone's mind, you can own them completely. The story we're about to uncover is not about the shape of the planet. It is about the shape of the prison built to contain it. Before we dissect the modern resurrection of the flat Earth, we must first clear our names of a crime we didn't commit. There is a persistent cultural hallucination that haunts our collective memory, the image of the medieval peasant, unwashed and terrified, standing on the shores of the Atlantic, believing that if a ship sailed too far, it would tumble off the edge of the world into a dragon-infested abyss. We imagine Christopher Columbus standing before a tribunal of dogmatic priests, a lonely man of science, fighting against a church that insisted the world was flat. This narrative is dramatic, it is heroic, and it is a complete fabrication. The truth is, nowhere in recorded history was the educated world convinced that the Earth was flat even long before we had the technology to prove it physically. The sphericity of the Earth was not a secret. It was established knowledge for over 2,500 years. The ancient Greeks had already solved this puzzle with elegant geometry. Eratosthenes had calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable precision centuries before the first cathedral was built. By the time the Middle Ages arrived, this knowledge had not been lost. It was preserved and taught. The Church, often cast as the villain in this story, was never reticent about the idea of a round Earth. In fact, the globular nature of the world was standard curriculum in medieval universities. So where does the story of Columbus proving the round Earth come from? It is a lie we tell ourselves to feel superior. The myth of the flat Earth Middle Ages was largely invented during the 19th century. Writers like Washington Irving in his fictionalized biography of Columbus dramatized the explorer's life to create a classic underdog story, the enlightened man of reason versus the dark forces of superstitious ignorance. In reality, Columbus never set sail to prove the Earth was round. Everyone already knew it was. His voyage was driven purely by economic and political interests seeking a faster trade route to the Indies. The actual debate he had with his contemporaries was not about the shape of the Earth, but its size. Columbus believed the ocean was small enough to cross. His critics correctly argued it was vast. He was lucky he ran into the Americas, or he and his crew would have died of starvation in the middle of a much larger ocean than he calculated. This historiographical distortion served a specific purpose for 19th century thinkers. By attributing a flat Earth ideology to the Middle Ages, they could paint the past as a time of absolute obscurantism, thereby making their own era of Renaissance and industrialization appear even more grandiose and enlightened. It was a propaganda campaign against the past. The tragic irony is that there are statistically more people today who sincerely believe the Earth is flat than there were in the entire Middle Ages. We created a fake history of stupidity to mock our ancestors, only to find that the stupidity has actually manifested in our own digital future. If the flat Earth Middle Ages was a lie, we must ask the detective's question, cui bono? Who benefits from the crime? To understand why this myth was manufactured, we have to look at the ideological battleground of the 19th century. This was not an era of simple discovery. It was an era of warfare between emerging secular institutions and established religious authority. This intellectual battlefield gave rise to what historians call the conflict thesis, the idea that religion and science have been in a perpetual violent death match since the dawn of time. Proponents of this thesis, largely operating in the late 1800s, needed a narrative weapon. To establish the supremacy of the modern scientific method, they needed to paint the religious past not just as mistaken, but as aggressively obscurantist. It wasn't enough for the Church to have been wrong about the position of the Earth in the universe. They needed the Church to have been wrong about the very shape of reality itself. By rewriting history, to claim that the medieval Church enforced a belief in a flat Earth, Victorian secularists could cast themselves as the heroic liberators of human reason, breaking the chains of 1,000 years of darkness. The irony is palpable. The Church in the Renaissance did persecute scientists, most famously Galileo, but those disputes were about heliocentrism, whether the Earth revolved around the Sun, and the theological implications of a moving Earth, or the possibility of extraterrestrial life. There was never a repression of the idea that the Earth was spherical. By conflating these two distinct issues, 19th century writers created a straw man so potent that it is still taught in schools today. They attributed an absurd, obsolete ideology to the past to highlight the grandeur and brevity of their own industrial period. But this revisionist history had a catastrophic side effect. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. As science aggressively secularized the understanding of the cosmos, a counter-movement of religious fundamentalism began to harden in response. In the mid-19th century, obscure ideologues began to read religious texts with a new defensive literalism. If the secular world mocked the Bible for being unscientific, these fundamentalists would double down. It was in this exact period, the very same century that invented the myth of the medieval flat earther, that actual flat earthers began to organize. Figures appeared who claimed that the Earth must be flat because it was God's work, basing their views on an integrist vision of religious books. They were ridiculed by mainstream theologians and scientists alike, but the seed was planted. The conflict thesis was intended to destroy the credibility of religious dogma but instead it inadvertently fertilized the soil for a modern reactionary denial of physics. We mocked a flat Earth that didn't exist in the past, and in doing so we summoned one into existence for the future. To find the true engine of the modern flat Earth movement, we must leave the abstract debates of the 19th century and enter the physical reality of the 20th. We must travel to the shores of Lake Michigan in 1901, where the smoke of industry mingled with the fervour of fanaticism. Here a man named John Alexander Dowie founded a settlement that was intended to be a literal heaven on earth Zion City. Dowie was not a simple country parson. He was a charismatic Scottish evangelist with the soul of an industrial tycoon. He envisioned a theocratic utopia, a place where the laws of God superseded the laws of the United States. He bought the land, drafted the blueprints, and invited his followers to build a new Jerusalem from scratch. But Zion was not merely a spiritual retreat. It was an industrial powerhouse. At its heart beat the rhythm of the Zion Lace Industries, a massive factory complex funded by imported Scottish weavers and the tithes of the faithful. Imagine a steampunk vision of a religious commune, the clatter of mechanical looms weaving fine lace day and night, generating the capital to fund a city where alcohol, tobacco and doctors were banned, and where the whistle of the factory regulated prayer as strictly as it did labour. For a brief moment Zion flourished, Dowie, calling himself the Restorer and adopting the persona of the prophet Elijah, ruled with absolute authority. He believed his cosmic thought could nourish his people, leading them into a new age. However, absolute power breeds absolute delusion. Dowie's messianic complex grew rapidly into megalomania. He began to adorn himself in high priestly robes, demanding complete subservience, while mismanaging the city's finances on a colossal scale. By 1905, the utopia was cracking. Dowie suffered a debilitating stroke that left him physically weakened, but his ego remained unchecked. The city was hemorrhaging money, plagued by accusations of corruption and bribery. The faithful were disillusioned. They saw their restorer spending their life savings on a lavish lifestyle, while the lace factories struggled to keep the lights on. Zion City was a powder keg of spiritual desperation and economic ruin waiting for a spark. Dowie, incapacitated and detested by his own community, had lost his grip. The city needed a saviour to rescue it from its own prophet. What they got instead was a wolf who would turn their isolation into a prison of geometry. Enter Wilbur Glenn Voliva. If Dowie was the charismatic dreamer who built the stage, Voliva was the cold-blooded operator who would lock the doors. Born in 1870 on an Indiana farm, Voliva was a man of sharp intellect and sharper ambition. He had joined Dowie's movement in 1899, mesmerised not just by the theology, but by the power structure. Recognising his managerial talent, Dowie had dispatched him to Australia to oversee the church's operations down under, keeping his ambitious lieutenant at a safe distance. But in 1906, with Zion City teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, and Dowie incapacitated by a stroke, the Restorer made a fatal miscalculation. He summoned Voliva back to Illinois, hoping his loyal subordinate would act as a financial firefighter to salvage the city's books. Dowie expected a saviour. What he got was an executioner. Voliva returned to find Zion in ruins. He surveyed the chaotic ledgers, the mounting debts, and the disillusioned populace. A lesser man might have tried to fix the leak. Voliva decided to steal the ship. He realised instantly that Dowie was no longer an asset, but a liability. In a move that would make a modern corporate raider blush, Voliva didn't offer support, he launched a hostile takeover. He presented the community with a stark choice: continue sinking with the erratic, paralysed old prophet, or follow the young, capable manager who promised stability. The coup was swift and brutal. Voliva didn't just push Dowie aside, he sued him. In a dramatic legal battle, Voliva exposed Dowie's financial mismanagement and corruption, using the very sins he was sent to cover up as ammunition to destroy his mentor. By 1907, the courts ruled in Voliva's favour. The founder was ousted, stripped of his assets, and left to die in disgrace while Voliva ascended to the throne. From that moment, the tone of Zion changed. The chaotic fervour of the revival tent was replaced by the cold efficiency of a totalitarian state. By 1910, Voliva had consolidated absolute power. He didn't just run the church, he owned the town. He bought up the property deeds and rebranded the entire enterprise under the chillingly corporate name Zion Industries and Institutions. Voliva established the Theocratic Party, a political machine that rigged elections and ensured that the town's government, police force and judiciary were all extensions of his will. This was the manifestation of the dark triad of personality traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy unleashed on a captive population of 6,000 souls. He was no longer just a pastor, he was the CEO, the mayor, the judge, and the jailer. And like any dictator with absolute control, he needed a unifying ideology to isolate his subjects from the outside world. He needed a wall. But since he couldn't build a physical wall around Illinois, he decided to build a wall in their minds. He was about to give them a new map of reality. To rule a flat world, Voliva realized he had to do more than just redraw the map. He had to kill Isaac Newton. The spherical Earth is held together by gravity mass attracting mass. If you accept gravity, you inevitably get a ball. Therefore, in the theology of Zion City, gravity was declared a lie. But Voliva faced a stubborn problem. If he held a Bible and let go, it dropped to the floor. Things fell. To explain this undeniable reality without admitting the Earth was round, Voliva proposed a theory that transformed our planet from a static stage into a kinetic nightmare. He claimed that objects do not fall downward, rather the Earth rises upward to meet them. In Voliva's model, the entire flat Earth disk is rocketing through the universe, accelerating constantly at a rate of 9.88 meters per second squared. When you jump, you're momentarily floating in the void, and the floor rushes up to smack the soles of your feet at a specific velocity. In modern physics terms, this is actually a bastardized version of Einstein's equivalence principle. Einstein correctly noted that inside a windowless room, you cannot tell the difference between standing on a massive planet and standing in a rocket accelerating at 1g. This is thrust gravity, a concept familiar to fans of hard science fiction like The Expanse. But while sci-fi ships use fusion drives to push a metal hull, Voliva turned the entire planet into a runaway spaceship. Let's run the simulation of this universal acceleration UA. If we take Voliva at his word, the Earth is an engine of infinite energy. It is a bottomless runaway ship fleeing from nothing, racing toward nowhere forever. We are not living on a peaceful geological formation. We are passengers on a vehicle that is being crushed against our seats by the sheer violence of its propulsion. Voliva, with the arrogance of a cult leader, ignored the mathematical consequences of his own invention. When critics pointed out the absurdity of this constant acceleration, he dismissed them. To him, the physics were secondary to the control mechanism. But the math is ruthless. If you accelerate at 9.8 meters per second squared, you don't just move, you accumulate speed. In the first second, you're moving at 22 miles per hour. By the end of the first year of creation, the flat Earth would be travelling at nearly the speed of light. Voliva likely didn't understand or didn't care that he had turned his world into a relativistic suicide machine. He simply needed a reason for his followers to stay grounded, literally and metaphorically. But by invoking this engine to explain why an apple falls, he inadvertently trapped Zion City in a trap far more dangerous than gravity. He set them on a collision course with the ultimate speed limit of the universe, the speed of light. And as we're about to see when a planet tries to outrun Einstein, the results are not just wrong, they are catastrophic. Let's do the math that Voliva refused to do. If the Earth were truly accelerating upward at 9.8 meters per second squared, starting from a standstill on the day of creation, it would not take eons to run into trouble. It would take less than a year. Specifically, after about 354 days of constant acceleration, the flat Earth would technically cross the threshold of the speed of light, as approximately 300,000 kilometers per second 1. This is where Voliva's theology crashes violently into Einstein's special relativity. According to the laws of physics that govern our universe, nothing with mass can reach, let alone exceed the speed of light. As an object approaches this cosmic limit, the energy required to accelerate it further increases exponentially, eventually becoming infinite. If Voliva's model were real, the energy required to keep the Earth pushing up against your feet for just one more second would exceed the total energy output of all the stars in the observable universe combined. But let's suspend reality for a moment. Let's imagine Voliva found a way to bypass the energy problem and kept the pedal to the metal. What would life actually look like on this runaway elevator? It would be a visual and radioactive apocalypse. As the flat Earth accelerates toward the speed of light, the view of the heavens would distort terrifyingly due to a phenomenon called relativistic aberration. The stars would appear to bunch together directly overhead, shrinking the visible sky into a blindingly bright tunnel of light. But the beauty would be short-lived. Due to the Doppler effect, the light waves from the stars we are rushing toward would be compressed blue shifting into higher frequencies. The gentle, visible light of the stars would shift into ultraviolet, frying the skin of every human on Earth in seconds. As we continue to accelerate, that light would shift further into X-rays and finally into gamma rays. In this scenario, the atmosphere or Voliva's dome would be bombarded by a relentless storm of high-energy cosmic radiation. The air itself would likely ionize and glow, stripping away the ozone layer and sterilizing the surface of the planet. Voliva wanted to create a safe enclosed world protected by God. Instead, his physics describes a planet being microwaved by the cosmos. Furthermore, there is the issue of time itself. At such relativistic speeds, time dilation kicks in. Time on the accelerating flat Earth would slow down drastically compared to the rest of the universe. While a few years passed for the faithful in Zion City millennia would pass in the stationary universe outside. The Earth would become a time capsule disconnected from the temporal flow of reality. Voliva, of course, dismissed gravity simply because he couldn't explain it without a sphere U. He replaced a gentle static force mass attracting mass with a kinetic mechanism that requires infinite energy and results in the radioactive incineration of humanity. It is a perfect example of how the common sense of the flat Earth, "I don't feel like I'm spinning, so I must be still," collapses the moment you apply rigor to it. To escape the prison of a round-Earth Voliva, built a vehicle that drives straight into a relativistic brick wall. If Voliva's physics turned the Earth into a radioactive rocket, his geometry turned the sky into an optical impossibility. To make the flat Earth model work, Voliva had to shrink the cosmos. He rejected the astronomical reality of a sun that is 150 million kilometers away and over 1 million kilometers wide. Instead, he proposed a local universe, a sun that is a mere fireball, 32 miles in diameter, circling just 3,000 to 4,000 miles approx, 6,000 kilometers above the clouds. This local sun model creates a nightmare for trigonometry. On a flat plane, basic triangulation should be easy. If you have two observers at different latitudes measuring the angle of the sun at the same moment, simple high school math should allow you to pinpoint the sun's exact height. But when you actually apply this to real-world data, the math breaks. The height calculated from New York doesn't match the height calculated from London. The data points never converge. The local sun exists everywhere and nowhere at once. But the most damning evidence is something you witness every evening the sunset. In Voliva's model, the sun functions like a spotlight moving across a dark ceiling. As it moves away from you, the laws of perspective dictate that it should diminish in size, shrinking smaller and smaller until it recedes into a tiny point of light and vanishes just like a car driving away down a long, flat highway. It should never physically drop below the horizon line because on a flat plane, there is no curvature to hide behind. Yet that is not what we see. We observe a sun that maintains a consistent angular size roughly 0.5 degrees in the sky from noon until the very moment it touches the horizon. It does not shrink, it sinks. It is swallowed by the curvature of the Earth bottom first. To explain this, Voliva and his modern successors rely on a kaleidoscope of ad hoc excuses blaming atmospheric lensing or water vapor magnification. They ask us to believe that the atmosphere acts as a perfect magical magnifying glass that keeps the sun looking exactly the same size even as it moves thousands of miles away. Voliva didn't just need a new map, he needed to rewrite the laws of optics to keep his followers in the dark. If Voliva's physics was a broken simulation, his governance was a perfectly functioning machine of psychological warfare. To understand the true horror of Zion City, we must look at it through the lens of modern cult analysis, the byte model, behavior information thought, and emotional control. Zion was not merely a religious community, it was a petri dish of faith, a sealed laboratory where Voliva tested the limits of human submission. The control of behavior was absolute and invasive. Life in Zion was dictated by a list of prohibitions so extensive it strangled the joy out of existence. Alcohol and tobacco were obvious sins, but Voliva went further. He banned theatres, cinemas and dance halls, cutting off all avenues of escapism. He regulated the very biology of his subjects, strictly prohibiting the consumption of pork and oysters, turning the dinner table into a daily test of obedience. Perhaps most sinister was the ban on modern medicine. Doctors were branded as sorcerers, and vaccination was forbidden. If a child fell ill in Zion, the parents were forced to pray rather than seek treatment, turning every fever into a potential death sentence sanctioned by the state. To enforce this, Voliva weaponized financial control. In a stroke of feudal genius, he abolished private property. No one in Zion owned their home. Instead, they signed 1100-year leases from Voliva's corporation. This legal fiction meant that Voliva wasn't just their pastor, he was their landlord. One wrong word, one act of defiance, or one secret visit to a doctor and a family could be evicted, stripped of their livelihood, and cast out into the wicked world they had been taught to fear. This leads to the control of information and thought. This is where the flat Earth theory ceased to be a cosmological quirk and became a psychological firewall. By enforcing the belief that the Earth was flat, Voliva created an epistemological quarantine. He taught his followers that the entire outside world, schools, governments, scientists, was part of a satanic conspiracy to hide the truth of God's creation. The flat Earth dogma served as the ultimate loyalty test. As Voliva infamously proclaimed on signs posted at the city limits, anyone who believed the Earth was round was lower than a dog and lower than a vandal. By forcing his followers to accept a reality that contradicted their own eyes and logic, he broke their cognitive autonomy. If he could make them agree that the horizon was flat, he could make them agree to anything. Finally, there was emotional control. Voliva cultivated a culture of paranoia, encouraging his followers to despise their neighbours and view the surrounding American towns as enemies. The more the outside world mocked Zion, the more Voliva claimed it was proof of their righteousness. The ridicule of the globularists became the fuel that kept the engine of the cult running. In Zion, freedom was not just illegal, it was a sin against the very geometry of the universe. While Voliva's cosmology was trapped in a pre-Copernican past, his methods were aggressively futuristic. He understood decades before the rest of the world that technology was not the enemy of fundamentalism, but its greatest amplifier. In 1923, he launched radio station WCBD, a broadcasting beast located right in the heart of Zion City. At a time when radio was still a novelty for many Americans, Voliva invested in a transmitter with a staggering power of 5,000 watts. This was not a local parish radio, it was a continental weapon. Utilizing the physics of skywave propagation, where radio waves bounce off the ionosphere to travel over the horizon, Voliva's voice could skip across oceans. His sermons, filled with vitriol against infidel astronomers and the globularist heresy, were heard as far away as Australia and Central America. Imagine sitting in a farmhouse in rural Nebraska in the mid-1920s. You tune your crystal set through the static of the ether, and suddenly a voice booms out of the silence. It is not offering gentle comfort. It is screaming about the shape of the world, predicting the apocalypse, and damning the scientific establishment to hell. Voliva was the original radio priest, the spiritual grandfather of modern shock jocks like Alex Jones. He realized that anger, fear, and conspiracy were the most effective ways to capture an audience's attention. WCBD became the mouthpiece of his theocracy. He used the station to dictate the news, to smear his political enemies, and to broadcast his specific brand of flat earth physics to a global audience. It was a terrifying paradox. He used the very electromagnetic waves discovered by modern physics to deny the existence of modern physics. He proved that you could use the tools of the Enlightenment to spread a new dark age. In doing so, Voliva laid the blueprint for every internet demagogue who would follow him a century later. If you control the signal, the truth is whatever you say it is. To truly understand the power of this geometry, you must step inside the simulation. Imagine for a moment that you're not reading this in the comfort of the 21st century. Imagine you are standing on the oil-stained floor of the Zion Lace factory in 1925. The air is thick with the smell of machine grease and unwashed wool. The deafening clatter of the mechanical looms fills your ears, a rhythmic industrial heartbeat that never stops. You're tired. Your shift began before dawn, but you do not complain. Complaint is a sin. You're not a citizen here, you're a tenant. You remember signing the 1100-year lease, a document that promised you a home in God's city, but stripped you of all ownership. You know that the roof over your head belongs to the General Overseer Wilbur Glenn Voliva. You know that if you're caught smoking a cigarette, or if a neighbour reports that you visited a doctor in Chicago for your child's cough, the lease will be voided. You will be on the street by sunset, branded a heretic and outcast from the only world that matters. Above the roar of the machinery, loudspeakers mounted on the factory walls crackle to life. It is his voice again. Voliva is preaching about the infidel astronomers and the lie of the globe. He tells you that the world outside the world of spheres and gravity is a chaotic void where men descend from monkeys and morality is a myth. Here under the dome you are safe, you are special, you are the chosen few who know the shape of God's footstool. Do you believe him? Deep down perhaps you have doubts. Perhaps you remember the physics you learned in a public school before you came here. But then you look at your hands stained with lace dye. You think of your family waiting in the house you do not own. You realize that belief is not a choice, it is a condition of your survival. You force your mind to bend. You tell yourself the horizon looks flat because it is flat. You suppress the questions until they stop coming. In Zion City, the flat earth is not a theory you discuss. It is the cage you live in, and the bars are made of fear. Every cult built on fear eventually runs into the same wall, the expiration date of its own prophecies. For Wilbur Glenn Voliva, maintaining the high-octane anxiety of Zion City required constantly raising the stakes. It wasn't enough for the world to be flat. It had to be doomed. Like a gambler doubling down on a losing hand, Voliva began to issue specific dates for the end of the world. First, he predicted the apocalypse would arrive in 1925. The faithful held their breath, some perhaps selling off their remaining possessions, waiting for the dome to crack and judgment to rain down. But 1925 came and went. The sun rose, the lace factories kept humming, and the flat earth kept not ending. Undeterred, Voliva recalculated. He pushed the date to 1930, then 1935, and so on. Each failure should have been a wake-up call, a crack in the glass of his authority. But paradoxically, in the short term, these failures often deepen the dependence of his core followers. This is the sunk cost fallacy of faith, having sacrificed so much: their diet, their property, their medical freedom. Admitting they were wrong was psychologically more painful than believing the next lie. However, the Great Depression did not care about Voliva's theology. As the American economy collapsed in the 1930s, the financial house of cards that was Zion Industries began to crumble. The lace factory, once the crown jewel, struggled. Voliva's extravagant lifestyle, his personal fortune estimated at $5 million, a staggering sum equivalent to over $120 million today, became impossible to hide. While his followers scrimped to pay their tithes and leases, their restorer lived like a king. By 1937, the reality distortion field finally broke. The state of Illinois and federal authorities began investigating the murky finances of Zion. They found a labyrinth of corruption, embezzlement, and Ponzi-like structures. The town was bankrupt. Voliva was forced into personal bankruptcy, stripped of his absolute control over the city's assets. But the ultimate irony was yet to come. Voliva had preached that his specific diet, often cited as Brazil nuts and buttermilk, combined with his refusal of modern medicine, would allow him to live to the biblical age of 120. He claimed his body was a temple of pure health, protected by his righteousness. Biology, like physics, refused to bend to his will. In 1942, shortly after confessing to misappropriating church funds, Voliva was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He didn't live to 120, he died at 72. He didn't ascend to heaven in a chariot of fire. He died in a hospital bed, likely surrounded by the very medical technology he had spent a lifetime demonizing. With his death, the spell was broken. The strict laws of Zion were repealed. The barriers came down. The flat earth globe in the schoolroom was replaced. But while Voliva died in disgrace, the virus he incubated did not die with him. He had proven that you could build an empire on a lie, provided that lie was big enough and repeated loud enough. The city of Zion moved on, but the blueprints for the prison remained waiting for a new architect to pick them up in the digital age. The physical walls of Zion City may have fallen in the 1940s, but the cognitive walls remained standing. Wilbur Glenn Voliva's death did not kill the idea. It merely forced it to mutate. The flat earth theory, once confined to a theocratic industrial town in Illinois, went dormant for a decade before finding a new host. It re-emerged in the 1950s with the founding of the International Flat Earth Research Society in Dover, England, and later migrated to California under Charles K. Johnson. But these were fringe oddities, analog relics kept alive by newsletters and snail mail. Then came the accelerant, the internet. If radio was the weapon of the 1920s, the algorithm is the nuclear option of the 21st century. The modern flat earth movement is not a return to the Middle Ages. It is a uniquely modern phenomenon, the direct descendant of Voliva's paranoid style. The internet provided exactly what Voliva had tried to build in Zion, a closed ecosystem where dissenting voices could be blocked and alternative facts could flourish unchecked. Today's social media platforms function as digital Zion cities. Their algorithms are designed to maximize engagement, not truth. They quickly learned that a user watching a video about a flat Earth conspiracy is likely to watch 10 more. The rabbit hole is not an accident. It is a feature. Just as Voliva used WCBD to bypass mainstream science and speak directly to the fears of the rural public, modern influencers use YouTube and TikTok to bypass educational institutions. Voliva was the patient zero of this specific strain of denialism. He proved that if you wrap a lie in the language of rebellion, framing it as us versus the elites, you can inoculate your followers against evidence. Every time a modern flat earther dismisses a NASA photo as CGI or calls an astronaut a Freemason, they are unknowingly echoing the sermons broadcast from a 5,000-watt tower in Illinois a century ago. The medium has changed, but the message remains the same. Reality is a conspiracy, and only the chosen few can see the wires. Ultimately, the autopsy of Wilbur Glenn Voliva's empire reveals a truth far more unsettling than any map he ever drew. The story of Zion City is not a lesson about geography. It is a warning about psychology. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality about the human condition. When faced with a choice between a complex truth and a comforting lie, we do not always choose the truth. We choose certainty. The universe revealed by modern science is vast, cold, and terrifyingly indifferent. We are microscopic specks clinging to a wet rock, orbiting an average star in the forgotten suburbs of a generic galaxy. We are rushing through a void that cares nothing for our existence, governed by forces like gravity and relativity that can crush us without a second thought. That is a heavy burden to bear. It offers freedom, yes, but it strips away our significance. Voliva offered an antidote to that cosmic terror. He sold a universe that was small, understandable, and centered entirely on us. In the flat Earth model, we are not accidents of stellar evolution. We are the protagonists on a stage built specifically for our drama. The dome is not just an atmospheric layer. It is a roof over our heads placed there by a protector. The walls of ice around the Antarctic were not just physical barriers. They were psychological guardrails promising that we could never fall off, never be lost in the infinite dark. Zion City was a prison undeniably. It was a totalitarian state built on fraud and fueled by paranoia. But for the thousands who lived and died there, it was also a fortress against the chaos of the 20th century. Voliva understood that if you can make people feel special, if you can convince them that they possess a secret knowledge the rest of the world is too blind to see, they will happily hand you the keys to their minds. As we close the file on this strange chapter of history, we should be careful not to laugh too loudly at the lacemakers of Illinois. Voliva is dead, but the impulse that created him is alive and well. In an age of information overload, the temptation to retreat into a smaller, simpler reality is stronger than ever. We all build our own invisible Zion City's echo chambers, where our biases are confirmed, our enemies are demonized, and the horizon is exactly where we want it to be. The Earth is round, gravity is real, the speed of light is the law. These are the hard facts of our reality. But the human mind, that is a landscape we are still struggling to map, and it is full of flat horizons where the sun never sets. Wilbur Glenn Voliva was a conman, a tyrant and a failed prophet. But he understood one thing better than any physicist to a frightened animal. Seeking meaning in the dark, a beautiful cage will always feel safer than the vast empty sky. We leave the ruins of Zion City, but we do not leave its shadow. Wilbur Glenn. Voliva is dead, buried beneath the very curvature he spent a lifetime denying, yet his blueprint for a reality-proof bunker thrives in the algorithms of our modern world. The flat Earth was never really about the horizon. It was about the desperate human need to be the center of the universe, safe, under a glass dome protected from the cold indifference of the cosmos. Today, that dome is built of pixels and echo chambers. The lesson of this history is stark. The most dangerous prisons are the ones we build for ourselves to keep the truth out. As we stare into our screens, let us remember that skepticism is the only key that fits the lock. The world is not flat, but the road to madness is a straight line. Keep questioning the map, stay curious, stay critical, and never stop looking up.